For generations, the daily newspaper has served as the unofficial citizen's handbook of the United States. As much as anything else, newspapers made possible an informed and involved electorate. But now, circulation is declining and the business model is failing. This week on Dialogue, newspapers in peril. Hello again and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. I'm John Molesky. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guests for this discussion are Leonard Downie, Jr., former executive editor of the Washington Post, now a professor at Arizona State University. Allison Silver, founder of the Washington Independent and contributing editor for the Huffington Post Investigative Research Fund. And Paul Starr, professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton and founding co-editor of the American Prospect. Welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us. Let's begin before we get into the current state of newspapers and look ahead to their future if they have one. Let's do a little bit of scene setting with historical context. And I'll ask each of you to weigh in on that and what you would identify in the United States as the high point for the newspaper business. Len Downie, let's begin with you.
I think it began roughly in the early 70s. And continued on through the end of the century. And then there's been a precipitous fall since then. At that time, strongly supported by advertising revenue, overflowing advertising revenue. Newspapers, even those without the best motivations, had the money to be able to hire large staffs and let them go about doing reporting in the public interest. They didn't all do that, and the reporting was very uneven across the country, but they were able to do that. And that was a period of great investigative reporting, beginning with the publication of the Pentagon Papers and Watergate investigation. Many newspapers had investigative staffs. They began covering subjects they hadn't covered before. They were influenced by the women's movement, by the civil rights movement, taking a profession that had been very white male oriented and making it much more diverse. And that was all going fine until the internet came along, and also consolidation of newspaper ownership, which meant that profit became more important than anything else for certain large chains. And they began cutting staff, and then the internet began cutting audience and cutting advertising. When I say cutting audience, I mean audience for the printed newspaper. Audience grew on the internet, but the audience for the printed newspaper declined. Okay, Allison Silver.
I would agree with that, but I would specify that I think Vietnam was the beginning of a really strong journalistic attitude in our country. When the readers as a whole began to pay attention to who the writers were and what the writers were up to. And that can, like with Halberstam or Sheehan in the war. And you'd had reporters earlier like Homer Bigart on the New York Times, but I don't think he had the following the way somebody like Halberstam developed. And in the 70s with Watergate, especially on the Washington Post, reporters were rock stars. And I think in the 80s it became harder, and in the 90s it was extremely hard. And I think it's all the aspects that Len just discussed, the conglomerates buying them, there was a sort of a contentment in the country where there wasn't as much questioning. I think also that you could think that journalism became less of a blue-collar industry. And there had been a sort of an outside or cocky feeling, whether that's true, but I have this feeling that that's what it was like. And it's kind of gotten more establishment as the century progressed. And I think that was also a problem.
That may be tied to that rock star notion that you introduced.
Yes.
Paul Starr.
Well, newspapers have dominated news and political communication for the past 300 years. They were the central artery of public discussion in this country from the founding of the Republic all the way up to the early 20th century. Now, they were somewhat set back in their role with the onset of broadcasting, first radio and then television, which then became the primary means for people to get direct access to the news, but newspapers continue to be the chief engine of reporting. They put most of the journalistic boots on the ground around the country. But newspaper circulation began falling per capita in the 1940s. It began falling on an absolute basis in the 1980s. Beginning in the 1960s and 1970s, one younger age cohort after another, one generation after another, began to read newspapers less and less. That gap has grown considerably. Newspaper readership, and by this I mean print and online together, has collapsed among young people.
Do we know why that decline began as far back as the 40s? Is it tied to electronic news sources?
Yeah, I think if you go back to the 40s, a lot of that was the movement to TV and radio before that. But this pattern is actually apparent not just in the United States. It's apparent through most of the advanced industrialized countries.
The same timeline?
Well, it's not exactly the same timeline, but young people have stopped reading newspapers to the same extent. If you go back to the 60s and 70s, we have surveys from that time, and they indicate almost no difference between young adults and older adults in the penchant for reading newspapers. That gap started to open up, and it's increased, as I said, decade by decade. And I think that is fundamentally a very bad sign for the future of the press.
Why? Let's develop that a bit. What are we going to lose if we lose newspaper readership?
Well,
are we losing newspapers? I mean, are we actually going to lose the form where I walked down the driveway this morning and picked up my morning newspaper? Is that an anachronism? Is that going away?
Well, I think there will be something that will fill that role. I'm not sure that it will fill that role as well at the state and local level as the regional papers have in the United States. We've had a very strong system of regional and local papers in the United States. I think the national press is going to survive fine. What I really worry about is that the sources of revenue at the state and local level are not going to match what regional papers have been able to have in the past, and I think we're going to lose a tremendous amount there. So
when you began at the Post, you're an investigative reporter.
Yes.
Right? We're covering D.C. and other places now.
Right.
This is the type of thing Paul's talking about. Who's going to watch the City Hall while others are watching the Capitol?
Right, and as Paul alluded to earlier, so much of the news that young people do get, as well as everybody else, in other forms, even literally on social networks, it originated with newspaper reporting. And so if you lose newsrooms entirely, it's not so much the printed newspaper. I think printed newspapers are going to be around for a while. Most of them are still barely making a profit after having really big profits in the past. More will die, but some will still be around. And of course, many will gravitate to other forms of publication, electronic forms of publication. But the question is, what size newsrooms will be left? It's not so much about newspapers, it's about the news. As Paul said, who's going to be covering all these local institutions? New ways of doing it are springing up. There are nonprofits that are starting up in various cities. Universities are beginning to do local reporting. Public radio and television in a few places around the country are beginning to do notable local reporting. And the question is, can we feed that garden? Can we help some of those sprouts grow as newspapers wither?
Allison, even in the best of times, investigative reporting was always the hardest budget item to sell. Lots of money spent for a little return, initially at least. Talk to us about some of these new emerging models that could potentially fill the gap that Paul described, although I'm not sure, as you said, that this is going to happen on the local level. They're happening nationally.
Well, I think there are some at the local, but let's talk about something like ProPublica, which is started by the former editor of the Wall Street Journal and the investigative editor, Steve Engelberg, from the New York Times. And they have a staff of really crackerjack reporters, if you can say, and they're funded fairly strongly, and they have been putting out very strong reporting on the stimulus and the economic situation, and also recently the NY Times magazine cover was a joint effort between a ProPublica doctor who is a doctor who is a reporter for ProPublica about the hospitals during Katrina. And ProPublica took a while to rev up. It took about 2 years, and now the pieces are coming in stronger. Each week, I think, there's an improvement. You have other places like Politico, which is picking up very strong daily and very smart political coverage. But then at the same time, you have places like the Voice of San Diego, or the Min Post, or what's going on in Seattle, where you have regions or towns that don't have a paper or that don't have good coverage anymore. And reporters are creating enterprises that are either non-profit or even cooperatives among all the reporters. And I think it's a startup, but I think they have a very strong instinct about what clear reporting is.
This nonprofit model, is there promise there? I mean, you see Charles Lewis, who founded the Center on Public Integrity, now out at American University doing the investigative journalism workshops. Is there hope there?
We're going to need a lot more of it. But resources are disappearing from journalism much faster than these sites can create them. That is the fundamental problem. And the people involved in Min Post and Voice of San Diego and other organizations like that will be the first to tell you that they do not have the resources to match a metropolitan paper's newsroom. And there is not really a prospect that they're going to be able to generate that out of advertising. So there's a need for a lot more resources to come in. I mean, I hope that more philanthropies will begin to look at this area. They're not accustomed to having to support journalism. They have to change, I think.
Have to view it as a charity suddenly.
Yeah.
Well,
they haven't before.
I would say, and I'm not alone in saying this is a transformational moment for journalism. And there are places like the Atlantic Philanthropies, which doesn't have a program in journalism, and yet it's become a key player. It's giving money to ProPublica, it's giving money to the Center for Investigative Journalism, it's giving money to the Huffington Post Investigative Fund, and the head of it has told me that he can see this because they have a program actually for the elderly, and they're doing it sort of he's doing it kind of out of his back pocket to cover journalists who are in a transition from papers to something else, because so many newspapers have shed jobs, and often the jobs they have shed are the most expensive.
About that, the shedding of jobs, let me ask you, if they had the current model today, you mentioned the Pentagon Papers and Watergate, right. Watergate you were intimately involved in, would the Washington Post and the New York Times, would they have the wherewithal today to do the same kind of reporting they did during those stories back then?
I hate saying this because you don't want publishers to hear this, but in fact, the newsroom at the time of Watergate, when I worked there, was still smaller than it is now. That is to say, a succession of editors, including myself, built it up to about 900 journalists, which was twice as big or more than it was during Watergate. And with modern technology and then bringing in another 200-300 journalists from our website into a merged newsroom, we're able to cut down the number of journalists along a lot and still produce Washington Post quality journalism. But that will still be a significantly larger newsroom if it's 500, 600 people, whatever it is, than most metropolitan newspaper newsrooms will now be around the country. I think they're going to wind up around 100 or 200. Now that will still be enough to do some significant local coverage. It will not be enough to spread as widely as they spread it before. They're going to have to decide on priorities. And it may be, and so things will suffer. And the question is, will there be intelligent decisions made about priorities? And will startups and foundation-supported nonprofits and so on, in a community like San Diego, which already has, I believe, 4 startups plus a newspaper struggling to stay alive, will they be able, as a new ecosystem, to cover all the bases that had been covered before? And we don't know that yet.
And I think this question raises another one. You mentioned the Pentagon Papers. The New York Times and the Washington Post had to fight the federal government. They had terrific legal counsel to do so. They and other news organizations have been able to wage many other fights versus the government, versus corporations, in order to be able to do a lot of the reporting that they've done. They've expanded the rights of the press. They've expanded the right of the public through many of these cases over the years. Will news organizations in the future will some of these online websites, will newspapers in much straitened circumstances be willing to fight these expensive legal battles? Will they be able to stand up against threatened lawsuits, libel lawsuits, and so forth? That really worries me.
And is it fair to say that the nature of news management has changed as well? That before there were more journalists involved in management, and now corporate bean counters, at the risk of being flip about it, have more of a say. And
that was definitely true. I think that was part of the decline of American newspapers, is that too many corporate bean counters were running large chains of newspapers with very little connection with the local newspaper itself and not much caring about the journalism. They only cared about the profits. And that was a problem. And actually, the fact that all that's breaking down may actually be, there may be a silver lining in that cloud. Among other things, because all the startups that we've been talking about have been started by journalists. They have to have financial backers, but the people that are running them are journalists, just like newspapers were once upon a time.
Have to create jobs for themselves since the big corporations are laying them off.
I would also say that as the editor of the Washington Independent, one of the first things I did is I contacted a major attorney who had dealt with journalism, and he'd worked with the Washington Post, actually, and he did pro bono work. He was very happy to do pro bono work for us. So I made sure before we printed anything, the first thing I had was a really good lawyer.
And in fact,
that's important.
Right, and in fact, a number of startups just recently have gotten together and formed something called the Investigative Reporting Network. No, this is different. It's the Investigative News Network.
Right, exactly.
And it's been formed by both national and local investigative startups. Most of the names we've mentioned here are part of it. And one of their first orders of business is to figure out how they're going to have combined legal representation.
Legal defense fund.
There was just a story recently in the New York Times about the diminished willingness of newspapers to fight court orders, closing courtrooms. And whereas in the past, again, newspapers would spend the money, they would hire the lawyers, they would fight these orders. And now, a lot of them just can't do it. So, I mean, I'm glad to hear there are funds being developed to defend journalists in the future, but realistically, if journalism is not as financially strong, it won't be able to uphold its values either.
Let me backpedal a bit and talk about two criticisms you hear of the newspaper industry and how it got into this mess, and get you to react to them and see if you think they're valid. One is newspapers were sort of smug and satisfied and too slow to respond to a changing environment. And then along with that is they made a boneheaded decision to give it away for free. And now, after putting it online for free, it's a hard sell to get people to start paying for what they're used to getting for free. Is that a fair criticism? Could newspapers have been more aggressive in reading the tea leaves and looking at emerging technologies and new business models? Micropayments, for example. iTunes. The music industry was in similar dire straits, and micropayments.
I mean, I know there's a lot of 2020 hindsight now about all of this and how they should have done it at the beginning. But the internet puts newspapers into competition with other news organizations that have never charged for content. Radio and television stations that are operating websites. And there are many other people offering news. I don't really think it is practical.
Why can't that advertising model that worked for the free content, nothing free, the radio and television were making money by ad sales, why can't that work for newspapers?
Well, it's not going to work for them any longer either, or at least not in the same way. Their
DVRs and TiVo.
Their advertising revenue has been falling, and actually their news audience has declined more rapidly than newspaper news audience.
Network news.
Yes, and they are shedding jobs just as fast as newspapers. So this advertising-supported model is breaking down for everybody.
What's left? Do we have the? I mean, it's back to what Paul said. Do we have the kind of journalism we need?
I would also say, though, that you hardly ever get kind of jaw-dropping innovation from the people who are at the top of the heap. The innovation comes from the people who are trying to get to the top of the heap. So you shouldn't expect, I think this kind of hindsight, the 2020 hindsight, why didn't they see that? It's okay. Why didn't they see that? I mean, it wasn't in their, I mean, they did think about it, but they would have been foolish to actually to think that why change the paradigm if they're at the top of the heap? And I think you also have to, so in a way, that's a very important mindset that was happening.
It was a mature industry, and the first, as she indicates, the first impulse of a mature industry is to defend what you have.
Think about Detroit.
We were thinking about that. I was there. We were thinking about the internet. We were putting things on the internet. We were one of the first newspapers on the internet, but we were not devising digital kinds of ways of doing business with news, not necessarily charging for news with a paywall, although actually there are a number of newspapers around the country that are located in smaller cities where there's no television station, there is no internet site competing with them for news, and they do have paywalls.
Also, there's the Easy Pass means where I think it's Steve Brill and some others are talking about sort of you pay your credit cards on file, and say for the first 50 articles or 100 articles you don't pay, and then you pay an incremental amount under a penny, and it just gets added up. And I always think something like the backstage pass at a concert might be helpful in that people get value added, which is really what the internet is about.
The New York Times tried that essentially with its columnists.
They tried that with Time Select, but the LA Times had tried that earlier, taking its critics out of the public debate and putting the critics behind the wall. And all that happened is the NY Times ended up hiring, I think, 3 of the LA Times critics because they were so angry they were not part of the discussion. Because one of the things writers do when they write is they have a public discussion with other writers, which is what the internet offers. And so that's why Time Select didn't really work. I mean, they had a very small amount who responded. But the thing is, those columnists were pulled out of the discussion, and it hurts them.
Mark Cuban has recommended that mainstream newspapers and other mainstream news sources go to war with the aggregators. Stop allowing them to cherry pick all of their content. You think there's any chance of that happening, or has this train left the station?
The aggregators also bring them traffic.
Right.
So
Well, that was the original reason to work.
It's a circular discussion.
Yes.
It's a hard war to fight. There's really a fundamental problem here, which is that the newspaper put together a package. Part of it was news about politics and public affairs, but there's a lot else in the package. The crossword puzzles and all the other things that sports and finance and so on. People might buy a newspaper just for one or another of these things, then get exposed to the news about the community and the world. Online, all these things are split apart. If you want to do puzzles, there are sites to do puzzles. If you want to know about sports, you go to ESPN.com. And the newspaper can't hold on to all these things anymore. And it's going to be very hard to hold on to the public that it put together.
I think that's actually okay.
Well, it would be okay if there was more demand for news about politics. That's the problem.
But if you look at the startups, they are disaggregators, to use that term. Voice of San Diego focuses on accountability reporting of government and the most important local issues. Something called SDNN, San Diego News Network, which is a new website out there, focuses on entertainment and what are you going to do tonight and aggregating blogs and sort of the social aspects of news. An investigative reporting thing called the Watchdog Institute is being formed at San Diego State in cooperation with the local newspaper. Their newspaper's outsourcing its investigative reporting to this group. It'll focus only narrowly on investigative reporting. The question is, will there also be a sports, outlet and something else to make up for what the newspaper used to do?
I'm sorry.
There's something like Maine Justice, which is simply covering the Justice Department, and that's a former reporter and several other former reporters from the Wall Street Journal. I mean, you have this niche opportunity that's been created, and they are taking it.
Along with niche comes small audience, and it's this thing that you mentioned about this greater public. And one of the problems we seem to have in our public discourse now is everybody brings their own facts to the table. There no longer seems to be some public watering hole where we could at least agree on basic facts.
I think it's going to be much more difficult in the future to create that sense of a unified and coherent public. I think it is splitting apart. I don't think it's going to be put back together. I'm perhaps much more pessimistic about this than almost any other aspect of this issue. There are reasons, I think, why also it's going to be more ideologically fragmented. The people who are interested in these issues about justice or any other issue are going to be people with strong political commitments, and they will divide ideologically. There will be the right-wing sites, there will be the left-wing sites.
Sounds like where we are right now.
Well, this is where we've been before. Paul said we had 300 years of newspaper dominance and news coverage in the country, but it was different until I think the mid-'60s, because they were party newspapers. There were many newspapers in any individual town. Some of them were better at sports than others, and people gravitated to them, like the Globe in Boston, for example. And they've represented various political points of view, as is still the case in most European countries. So we're sort of going back to that in a different way, but I do agree with Paul. It was terribly convenient to be able to have these conveners, to be able to watch CBS News and get everything that you wanted to from what you felt was a neutral point of view, and it had a certain authority to it, or to read the New York Times with that same authority, and that's what we'll be missing. On the other hand, proponents of the internet would say that's a great thing. Let me decide. Let me go through the internet. You come to me and say, here's your argument for why I should read you, but I get to decide in the end. You're not giving me a package that somebody else prepared for me.
Time's really tight, so time for a quick last thought. And if you have something positive to say, give us some hope.
You mentioned CBS News, and I think the death of Walter Cronkite reminded people about an era that has passed. No one today can occupy the position that Cronkite had with the confidence of such a wide portion of the public. And I think this is a serious political matter for the future of this country. Who is going to be able to command that confidence in the future? How are we going to have that trust?
Allison, you're one of these new media types. You okay with that? We can live without Cronkite? And we have about 30 seconds for you to respond to that.
I think we have to live without Cronkite. I don't think we have any option. And Cronkite was a terrific, incredible reporter. An old producer of his told me that one time when he couldn't come up with the story that Cronkite felt was out there, Cronkite had a chair up and over his head and was going to throw it at him across the room during an editorial meeting. The only reason he didn't throw it was he lost his balance, because he knew the story was the most important thing. And I think all of these startups, and I think every journalist out there is trying hard because they know how important the story is.
That will have to be the final word. Ironically, in a discussion of newspapers, we end with Walter Cronkite, the Dean of Television Journalism. So I don't know how we did that, but thank you for joining us. Really appreciate it. And unfortunately, we are out of time for this week's discussion. In addition to thanking our guests, I want to tell you that we appreciate your comments and encourage you to share them with us. And you can do so by sending us an email at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org, which you can see on your screen. So until next week, for all of us at the Wilson Center on Dialogue, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.
Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue can be seen on the MHZ Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, please visit www.worldview.org.